I'm really pleased and honored to introduce you to Leah, to Mrs. Leah Herzog. She is a noted lecturer. She's been teaching and has been doing lectures and teaching classes for over 30 years. And she made Aliyah with her husband, Avi, about 2 years ago, is it already?
Almost July.
Almost 2 years. And she's working for other, educational institutions. And I just wanted to go over just 2 items. If everyone would mute themselves, it would make everything much easier in case. And if you can, to turn off your phone or put it on vibrate, whatever works for you. And as far as questions,
just one second. Hi, good morning. I just was with a group of ladies who was on different meeting, waiting for this class.
really?
We connect to Torah War. It is group of 6 women.
Oh, really?
And I just now realized we put a different code and we're all together, but we cannot connect to you.
Oh, okay. So that's what's going on. All right. So they gave you the wrong code. So where did you get the code from? The passcode, is that what's wrong?
Yeah, I got the passcode from the last Torah War, but before I was on the wrong one. And it was 6 hours included, like Toby, Karen Green, and a few other women who waiting for class to start.
Oh,
On different meeting.
so you know what, Henny, would you mind maybe reaching out to Andrea and telling her that she has to, I don't know how to do this. That is really
Maybe to
make a phone call to one of the people.
Yes.
And give them
all right.
a new
So
phone.
who do you know who you recall? Karen? Was Sarah?
Karen Green, Toby, and other people. We probably know who else. I
Wow.
just, yeah. But it is like was 6 women who in different.
Yeah. So would you mind, Henny? Because
I can't because I'm on my phone.
It's not a problem.
Oh, good.
I could call Karen Green.
I'll call
Okay.
Ken. You want to call Karen Green? Who else is involved, Hannah?
I'm calling her.
Tova is already, should be on. Tova Zimmer is already on, I think.
Okay, who
Yeah,
else?
sorry for this. I don't know
Somebody
why.
just called me too. I don't know who it was, but
Okay.
because
All
the,
right.
Hannah, who else was it?
Karen, that's Lee Greenberg. Hannah Lannis just said you're having difficulty.
you know what, they may not have the correct
I
meeting
know.
number and passcode.
Well,
It was on the
Okay,
phone.
I
That's why I
understand you're
realized.
having trouble getting on to Leah Herzog. Okay, let me give you the number. Are you ready to write? 8, 6,
all right, I'm gonna
9,
take that.
2947. Passcode 475590.
Lee, if she could pass that on to anyone she's seen in that group that doesn't have the correct codes, that would be great.
Well, if you could let them know, that's what I was just told. Okay, thank you so much. Okay,
Thank
bye.
you. So sorry. Sorry, Leah. for this
It's
glitch.
trust me, this is, I'm glad it's not just me who has trouble with technology. It's
Okay,
been a very steep learning curve, that's for sure.
Right. I also did want to mention to everyone that I put in the chat, at least I think I did, yes, I did, the link to Leah's source sheets. So if you want to go on the chat, you can download, or whatever the correct term is, the Google Doc for the Leah's source sheets for today. And without further ado, I'm going to just go
okay, let her do it, because if
Okay.
anybody does
And
that.
please mute it.
we
Please
lose-
mute
yeah.
yourselves.
I think the other thing is that Sharon has the link to the source sheet, and if for whatever reason you want it and you can't download it, then Sharon will share it with you afterwards. And I'm going to screen share in a second, so you guys will be able to see the sources as I'm going through them. Okay, so first and foremost, hello everybody, and It's really a pleasure and an honor, and I'm so excited that Sharon asked me to do this, and I'm really excited to be able to teach Torah through this kind of new and wonderful way of Zoom. I was teaching in a different class of mine about how we don't even stop to think anymore about things like the fact that I'm sitting here in Israel, which is, some 6,000 miles and 7 hours ahead of all of you. And I'm looking at a piece of plastic basically and talking at it. And you guys are over there and you are looking at your pieces of metal and plastic, and you can see me and hear me, and we can sit and learn Torah together. And that's, to me, that's kind of a miracle, either with a small m or a large M, whichever way you want to say it. Okay, so without further ado, I am going to share my screen with you. Here we go, and we will get into the shir. Okay, so the title of the shir, as was publicized, is counting the Omer. I'm just going to do one other thing, which I think will certainly make it a little bit easier for me, and I've been told easier for other people. And so now you're not seeing things. I did invert the screen to white on black because I have been told that it's actually easier for people to see, and it's certainly easier for me to see. So what we're going to talk about today is this idea of Sfira ta Omer, of counting the Omer. And what I want to look at is look at the verses, look at the psukim, look at what these words actually mean, what they are trying to teach us, and thereby understand why we do this, and why this was a mitzvah in the first place, and why this is a mitzvah that we still carry on. I'm not going to talk about Rabbi Akiva. I'm not going to talk about any of the later attributions to Sfira ta Omer, and I'm actually not even going to talk about Matan Torah. In other words, the fact that it's 50 days, and then after that is Shavuot, and we connect Shavuot to Matan Torah because that connection is definitely there, but it's not as clear as we all sometimes think it is, and that's the topic of a different shiur. So let's like jump right in and let's look at the text in front of us. So this is in Sefer Vayikra. It's actually next week's Parashat Shavua. This week we have Achrei Mot Kedoshim, and next week we do Emor. So the context, and we'll talk about that in a second, is Sefer Vayikra is Parshat Emor, and these two psukim come within the context of going through the various moadim, the various chagim. Right, so usfartem lachem mimracharat Shabbat, and I'm going to just do my own simultaneous translation, but this is courtesy of Sefaria. So you will count for yourselves from the day after the Shabbat, miyom aviachem et omer hatanufa, from the day that you bring this Omer, and Omer is an amount, so that you bring this Omer that is waived. Sheba Shabbatot Tmimot Tihiyana, that it will be, you'll start counting 7 full weeks. Ad mimacharat Shabbat Hashvi'it, until the day after the 7th Shabbat. Tisperu Chamishim Yom, you will count 50 days. V'hi kravtem mincha chadasha laHashem, and then you will bring a new korban, or a korban of the new grain, to Hashem. And there are tons and tons of questions that arise out of this text, halachic questions, parshanut questions, but what I want to focus on is as follows. I want to understand what it means to count, right? Why are we counting? Why are we counting days? That's number one. Question number two is, why are we counting 7 full weeks, right? We see this idea of a week and of 7, right? And the beginning of the week and the end of the week. And then the other thing I want to look at is the significance of what I call 7 plus 1. So in this case, it's 7 weeks, 7 times, and in this case, it's the number 50. So we're going to look at counting and what that means to count, what gets counted, what doesn't get counted, how things get counted, how things shouldn't get counted, and then look at this idea of numbers and the importance of numbers. So let's start off with the context of this mitzvah, because the context is actually important. This mitzvah is located in Sefer Vayikra. Sefer Vayikra is also known as Torat Kohanim. It is the Sefer that deals primarily with the various rules, the various halachot that have to do with the priests, with the Kohanim, with the priestly service, the avodah and the Beit HaMikdash, the avodah and the Mishkan, right, the tabernacle, later the temple, with the sacrifices, with and really the nitty-gritty details of the sacrifices. What gets sacrificed, how it gets sacrificed, how it gets cut up, who gets what piece of meat, what gets burnt, what do we do with the blood, all, you know, it's literally very much nitty-gritty. What are the rules that are particular to a Kohen? What is a Kohen allowed to do, not allowed to do? Who's a Kohen allowed to marry, not allowed to marry? And this takes up a good chunk of the Sefer, right? It is Parshat Vayikra, Parshat Tzav, Shmini, Tazria, B'Tzorah, which we read last week, has to do with the Tum'ah and Tahara, the purity and impurity of people. Kashrut has to do with the purity and impurity of animals. Take a little bit of a break for Parshat Kedoshim, which is this week. Achrimot is the Arayot, again, the relationships that are permitted and are not permitted. And the next week we're back in Emor, and the beginning of the parasha is Emor El HaKohanim, right? Say specifically to the Kohanim. So we have to ask ourselves a question: why are these chagim, and that's the context of the Omer. And here you have, I'm not going to go through these verses, but here's our context, right? Vaydaber Hashem Moshe lemor, daber b'nei Yisrael v'amarta aleihem moadei Hashem asher tikra'u otam mikra'ei kodesh elahei moadai, right? So that's our context, is holy days. And it starts out with Shabbat, and then it goes to what we know of as Kiddush for the Chagim, Eila Moadei Hashem, Mikra'ei Kodesh, Asher Tikru'u Otam B'Moadam, etc., etc. And then it starts off with Pesach, and then it goes into this Karban Omer, this barley sacrifice that we do starting the day after Pesach, right? And then we have our psukim, and it goes on and it talks about the other chagim, about Shavuot and about Sukkot, right? So the mitzvah of Omer is part of this context of chagim, and the chagim are part of the context of the service in the temple, and the service in the temple is part of the context of holiness, right? This Sefer Vayikra is all about what it means to be holy. And I'm going to come back to that at the end, because at the end of the day, that's what everything we do relates to, is being holy. But if we think about counting, which seems to be extremely mundane, then what does counting have to do with being holy, right? So we've addressed the fact that it's in Parshat Emor, which is rules having to do with the Kohanim, and we're talking about the fact that it's Moadei Hashem Mikra'ei Kodesh. So let's spend a minute here talking about what is a Moed, and what does it mean Mikra Kodesh, right? A Moed comes from the word aid, right? Edut, witnessing. They are called Moadim because these are days that are based on the declaration of the new moon. And the declaration of the new moon is something that is done by two witnesses that would come to the Beit HaMikdash. In other words, our lunar calendar, the calendar of our Chagim, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, right? The biblical Chagim calendar is a calendar that's based on human beings. Matter of fact, there was just a discussion. I'm doing Daf Yomi for the first time, and there was just a discussion I think it was either yesterday's daf or the daf the day before, we're in Masechet Yoma, which discusses Yom Kippur. And it mentions the fact that Yom Kippur is a day that's dependent on humans, right? We decide when Rosh Chodesh Tishrei is, and 10 days later is Yom Kippur. So if we stop to think about that for a second, that's actually a really incredible thing, is that our calendar and our holidays and our practices, the whole religious practice around the holiday celebration, and like we just came off of Pesach and we're heading towards Shavuot, it's all dependent on us, right? And yet they are called Moadei Hashem because we're in partnership with God. Right? That's what Torah is actually about. Torah is about a partnership. It's a covenant between us and God. We say that, in Kiddush of Shabbat morning, V'shamru b'nei Yisrael to Shabbat, right? Oti beini ubein b'nei Yisrael, oti leolam. It's a brit, it's a covenant, it's a sign, and that the whole Torah is in fact a covenant and a sign. So even though we're the ones that are bearing witness and deciding when the Chagim are, so to speak, we're together with God in doing that. And being that we are calling the Chagim, right? That's why they're called Mikra'e, that we are calling them, but they're also Kodesh because we're doing it for Hashem. So part of what Kiddusha is, part of what it is to be a Kohen, to be a Kohen, by the way, means to be a servant. Likahen means to serve. So any Kohen is a servant. When we think of ourselves as Mamlechet Kohanim, right, as a nation of priests, what that means is we are a nation of servants. We are servants of Hashem, of God, and we are also servants of other human beings. So when we celebrate Chagim, or when we count the Omer, when we do anything that is recorded in this section here, right, we are in a partnership with Hashem, sanctifying Hashem and making Hashem ourselves holy and making Hashem's name great in the world by our practice. So what's happening here? What's this counting thing? So let's go back a little bit, right? Look back here at the first time the idea of counting appears in the Torah, right? It says this mitzvah begins and you will count for yourselves. So what I want to focus on now for a couple of minutes is, number one, this idea of counting. What's it all about? And number two, what it means count for yourselves, right? It should just say count, usvartem. We don't necessarily need the word lachem. The first place that the Torah talks about counting is in Sefer Breshit, the book of Genesis, Perek Tet Vav. Perek Tet Vav is what we know more commonly as the Brit Bein Haptarim, the covenant between the pieces. The Perek begins with Abraham being increasingly concerned over the fact that he doesn't have any children. He doesn't have any heirs. This is before Yishmael is born. And he is also concerned about his entitlement to Eretz Yisrael, because again, he currently at this moment doesn't own any of Eretz Yisrael. He hasn't even bought Marat HaMachpelah yet. That doesn't happen until much later. And then the third reason that he's worried, which is the most immediate reason, is that in the previous Perek, he gets sucked into a regional war because he has to swoop in and save his nephew Lot. But this war that occurs in chapter 14 in Perek Yudalet is actually a pretty big war between some pretty big kings and city-states that existed at the time. And Abraham's genuinely concerned that these kings, particularly the kings on the losing side, are going to come after him. So God comes to him at the beginning of the Perek and he says, don't worry, right? I'm going to protect you and you're going to inherit this land. And Avram says back to Hashem, well, who am I going to give it to? I don't have any children. The only person that I seem to have is Eliezer, is my right-hand man, my chief of staff, but I don't have any biological heirs. So Hashem says, don't worry, you will have children. And Hashem says to him, and this is our pasuk here, Hashem took Abraham out of his tent, and he said, look up to the sky and count the stars. See if you can count them. And then Hashem says, this will be your children. So the first time we have the word counting, it's associated with something heavenly, the stars. It's associated with a promise that Hashem makes to Abraham, a promise that he then solidifies in this covenant, this Brit Bein Habtarim, these animal pieces that are cut in half. And it's a promise that we see fulfilled. And we see that we come down to Mitzrayim with 70 people, and 210 years of slavery later, we are a nation of 600,000. And that's 600,000 men between the ages of 20 and 60. And that doesn't count Shevet Levi, and that doesn't count the women, and it doesn't count the children, and it doesn't count the old people, right? So we go within the course of 2 centuries and 2 centuries of great hardship from 70 to 600,000, right? And this is a direct evidence of this promise. So whenever we see this idea of counting, we have to go back and think about the fact that this concept of counting is something that is fundamentally holy and is fundamentally connected to God, which sounds really weird, because counting is actually something very mundane, number one, and number two, very physical, right? We count things, we count people, we count days, we count books, we count, items in our shopping cart, we count numbers, and numbers are kind of the most mundane, concrete, earthly things that we have. And yet when we see the number of, when we see this word, usifartem, right? You will count. What our minds really should be doing is scrolling back to the first time we were commanded to count something and what that counting represents. Just on a little bit of a side tangent, right? The word to count, which is lispor, is related also to the word to tell, lisaper, right? Or in English, to count and to recount. So when we think about telling over a story, which is so much a part of our religion and a part of our culture, what we're also doing is we're basically connecting the dots. We're connecting the dots in the story, but we're also connecting the dots between ourselves in the present and whatever dots might be in front of us in the future, but also to all of the dots in the past, right? Anytime you retell something, you recount something, you are connecting yourself and your listener, your audience, to others, to other people, other events, right? And we see that most clearly, obviously, in the Haggadah. So that's the other thing, is that when Hashem is telling Moshe, and Moshe is giving this over to Bnei Israel, and they hear these words, usfartem lachem, and these words come right after, right? This mitzvah comes right after the mitzvah of Pesach, and everything that's involved in Pesach is geared towards v'higadat lebincha, right? That you will tell your children about what happened in the past and how Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim and everything that happened in the desert, right? And how Hashem took care of us. So now these ideas start coming together, right? We have the counting of the stars in Hashem's promise. We have this mitzvah of Karban Omer, of counting the Karban that follows immediately after Pesach, and what Pesach is all about, and how it connects Pesach on one end to Shavuot on the other end. And just as a reminder, in this section here of the Torah, the Chagim are harvest festivals. Everything about the Chagim, as listed in Parshat Emor, has to do with the agricultural cycle, right? So Pesach is not just about when we left Mitzrayim, but Pesach is the beginning of the new wheat. That's the Mincha Chadasha, right? That's the for anybody who grew up in the traditions and the laws of the Soloveitchiks and the Briskers, right? You know that this idea of what's called Chadash, that you people still to this day don't eat wheat and wheat products that was harvested between Rosh Hashanah and Pesach until after Pesach. And here in Israel, we don't have to really worry about that because that's how things are made. But I know that in the States, for people who keep Chadash, who are makpid, who are strict about these things, it gets to be pretty complicated. So what we're talking about in Parshat Emor is Pesach as being the beginning of the grain harvest, the wheat harvest and the barley harvest. Shavuot being the end of that, what we would call winter wheat, the Chag HaKatzir, and Sukkot, where we take the species and we celebrate the end of the summer harvest, right? So it's yes, the idea of Yitziat Mitzrayim and Hashem protecting us in the Midbar, right? We sit in Sukkot because Hashem, again in these psukim, v'hoshavti etchem b'Sukkot, right? That in the Midbar, Hashem, in the desert, God took care of us and took care of our needs, but they are fundamentally agricultural harvest festivals. And no one is more keenly aware of Hashem's providence than a farmer. Right? If it rains at the proper time, doesn't rain, if it's too hot, too cold, if there are bugs, if there, whatever it is. So the fact that counting is tied to a harvest, is tied to Hashem's promise, is tied to the stars, right? Kind of you hopefully you see this picture growing and growing and growing and growing, right? That these things are connected. Let's talk for a minute about the word lachem, usvartem lachem. And again, we get connected to Abraham. This mitzvah of counting the Omer actually ties back in numbers of ways to Abraham and to the fact that Hashem chose Abraham to be the beginning of a new nation and made a covenant, made a brit with Abraham and made promises to Abraham. And those promises are kept until today. And we, in our Shmona Esrei, at the end of the first bracha, the first blessing of the Shmona Esrei, we say, Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you Hashem, Magen Avraham, the protector of Abraham. We don't say Magen Avraham Yitzchak Yaakov, right? We mention Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov in that first bracha of Shmona Esrei, but the end of the bracha, the end of the blessing, we only mention Avraham because Avraham was the beginning, and Avraham was where we started, and Avraham found Hashem, and then Hashem picked Avraham, right? So again, each one of us in a way has to follow that example where we look for God and seek out God, and God will connect with us. So Hashem, at the beginning of Parshat Lech Lecha, right? This is Perek Yud Bet, chapter 12. It's the same parsha that chapter 15 is in. It says, Vayomer Hashem el Avram, this is before his name is changed, Lech Lecha, right? Go. We'll talk about Lecha in a second. Me'artzecha, from your land, from your birthplace, from your father's house, to the land that I show you, right? This is the first of the famous 10 tests. So the commentaries ask you, what does this mean, Lech Lecha? Go for yourself, right? And here, if you look at the English translation, the Lecha, the for you, this word isn't even mentioned, right? It says, go forth from your native land. And this is, always a bit of a caution when looking at translations, and the downside of a translation is that any translation kind of limits our understanding in terms of its relation to the original. That's not to say translations are bad, right? We love translations. They're really, really important. They open us to things that we might not have access to because we don't speak the language, right? I could never read Tolstoy in the original because I don't speak Russian. I could not read Victor Hugo in the original because I don't read French, right? But because they're available to me in translation, I can be exposed to the beauty of literature that's written in other languages. On the other hand, I would imagine anybody who can read Russian, understand Russian fluently, or can read and understand French fluently will tell you that a translation of Tolstoy or a translation of Hugo is going to be imperfect, right? Because it's not the original, and you don't have the illusions, you don't have the connections that you would have from the original. So lecha, right? Go lecha, for you. So Rashi here, and I didn't bring this Rashi, but Rashi explains that lecha means for your benefit. Do it for yourself. And why is it for yourself? Why is it for your benefit? Because if you do all of these things, then what we have in the following psukim is God will make you a great nation, and your name will be blessed, and all of these things that listening to Hashem actually benefits you. So that sounds kind of self-serving, right? But what I think is important to understand from this Rashi is that we don't just quote unquote blindly serve Hashem. When we do a mitzvah, and the Torah points this out over and over and over again, there is benefit to us. The Ramban Nachmanides, who we're going to get to in a couple minutes, in his first explanations of Sefer Bereshit, of the book of Genesis, asks the same question that Rashi asked, right? Why does a book of laws begin with the stories of creation? Why does it begin with the stories of creation, of the flood, of all the forefathers? Why doesn't it just start with the mitzvot, right? That's like saying the Constitution of the United States should start with a brief overview, or maybe even not such a brief overview, of the history of the United States from whatever 15 something, or at the very least 1620 to 1789. But it doesn't. It begins with the words, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union," right? One very brief paragraph, and then we get into rules. Well, the Torah does not give us a very brief paragraph. It gives us a whole book and then some. So the Ramban answers the question by saying the purpose of Sefer Bereshit is to teach us an incredibly fundamental concept. And it's the concept, to paraphrase Dostoevsky, of not just crime and punishment, but reward and punishment. That every action has a consequence. And so number one, there's no such thing as fate, right? The ancient world was a very fatalistic world, right? You were born a certain way, your fate was written in the stars, you died. Judaism is not like that. You're born a certain way, and then you have choices. And not only do you have choices, and here we go back up to this pasuk, is that Hashem can override the stars based on your choices. There's a very famous midrash here that says, what does it mean that Hashem took him out? Hashem took him out of his fate. There was a fate written that Avram and Sarai would not have children. And Avram knew that. And Hashem said, forget about your fate. I can override your fate. I can change your name. I can change your fate. You behave in a certain way. Your behavior affects the outcomes, what happens to you. You are in control to some degree of your life. We're all in control, some degree of our lives. Again, we're in a partnership. So what Rashi is saying here is, again, if we do what Hashem asks of us, it's not blind. There is a benefit, and we're entitled to know what that benefit is. And Hashem is very clear with Abraham what that benefit is, and we see that played out. But the Malbim, who is a much later commentary, Rashi lived in the late 1000s and the Malbim lived in the 1800s, explains it a little bit differently. He says, Lech lecha, like go into yourself, not for yourself, but into yourself, like become your own person. Leave your father's house, leave your land, leave your culture, leave everything aside, and and become your own narrative, your own identity. So when we count, in the Malbim's view, right, usfartem lachem, when we count, it gives us, every day gives us an opportunity to reflect, right? Today was day one. What happened today? Today was day two. Today is day two because yesterday is day one. Counting gives us an opportunity to reflect and to take stock. So counting the Omer isn't just counting from 1 to 50. Counting the Omer is thinking about today, thinking about yesterday, thinking about tomorrow, thinking about our actions and what consequences may there be to those actions. How can I make tomorrow better than what it is today? How can I appreciate yesterday as much as I appreciate today? So that's the Svartem Lachem. I'm going to go back here to a second for a little bit now to the what do we count, what don't we count, and how do we count. So numbers in Torah are important. And we have numbers of people. 70 people came down to Mitzrayim. 603,550 people were the total that we had at the beginning of Sefer Bimidbar, not including women, children, and Shevet Levi, right? We know there are 12 tribes. Right? We have numbers. It's not that we don't have numbers, but we have to be really careful when we're counting as to how and why we're counting, right? So the Torah says when it comes to days, right, usfartem lachem. But when it comes to counting people, it uses two different verbs. It uses the word linso, which is nun samach, the shoresh is nun samach aleph, which means to raise, lift up, or carry. And it uses the word, the shoresh pei kuf dalid, which means to take, also to take note of, but also to appoint and to remember. That this section here is about the machatzita shekel, right? So Hashem says to Moshe, right, when you count Bnei Israel, how do you do that? Each person gives a kofer nafsho la Hashem. Again, it's something that goes to Hashem. And what is it? It's this machatzita shekel. It's this half a shekel, which was used to finance the Beit HaMikdash for the year. It was used to buy the sacrifices, to buy the wood, to buy the wine, the oil. Every human being, every citizen, man and woman, over the age of 12 or 13 was required to give a half a shekel to the temple for the temple service. But that was also the way a census was taken. You counted coins, you counted money, you didn't directly count people. And we see this again in Sefer Bimidbar, the beginning of the book of Numbers, where Moshe is commanded, right? Hashem says to Moshe, Bimidbar Sinai, from the Ohel Moed, in the desert of Sinai, wilderness of Sinai, in the Ohel Moed, and it says to them, he says, Su'u et rosh kol adat b'nei Yisrael, right? Again, lift up, raise, but this is with the meaning of counting. This is another census that's being taken here. Kol adat b'nei Yisrael mishpachotam, according to their families, their fathers' houses. And we have this really weird phrase here, bimispar shemot, with the number of names. Right? So we have this mispar, we have this usfartem, we have this number thing going on, but we have it, the number of names, which seems like a contradiction, right? Either you have numbers or you have names. You don't have both. So the Ramban, Nachmanides, and I have it here for you in both Hebrew and English, gives us an incredibly beautiful explanation. So the Ramban starts off, and he ties it, in my opinion, back to the concept of Sfirata Omer, right? And that using counting as a means to an end and not an end to itself. So he says in Pasuk Gimel, which is the Pasuk that we just read, right? When Ka'asher tziva limnot et Yisrael, when Hashem commanded Moshe to count Bnei Yisrael, he says tifkedu otam, right? He uses this shoresh, this root word of pei kuf dalet, right? And that root word means lirmos, to hint at us, shelo yisperein, that we shouldn't count rak except sheyitnu kofer nafsham. That again, it goes back to the machatzita shekel, that we only count using the coin. Ubahem yashgiach v'yeda b'mispar ha'am. And through the machatzita shekel, we know the number of the nation, right? We count the coins, because what lifkod means is also to set something aside, right? To appoint something, to make it noteworthy. So how do we count Bnei Israel in a way to make them noteworthy? By counting the coins that they contribute to the temple, to the Mishkan. That's one way of doing it. But then later on in the chapter, later on in the parak, the Ramban explains it slightly differently. Right? And here's the census, right? He says, and the Pasuk says, and it was all of the ones that were counted of Bnei Israel according to their father's house, etc., etc., all of the men that went out to the army in Israel, and the Pasuk, completes the census, and that's where we get the 603,550. So the Ramban explains, right, why do we need to repeat this, right? We know what's going on. We know that Moshe has been counting Bnei Israel because Hashem told him to count, and then he goes and he counts, and each tribe's census is listed. The tribe of Yehuda has this many, and Dan has this many, and Binyamin has this many, right? Why do we need to repeat it at the end? So the Ramban says as follows: Hutzracha katuv lahagid mispar haklal. The text needs to tell us the final number. Le'achar shehigid hapratim, after it says the details. Ki nitztaveh Moshe ve'Aharon, because Moshe and Aaron actually got this as a divine command. Right? This isn't just for strategic purposes. This isn't just purposes of pride. Right? Wow, look at us. This is a divine command. Sheyed'u mispar mifkad ha'am, that they should know how many is in the nation. Veyed'u mispar kol shevet, that they should know each shevet. Ki kein derech hamlachim, yes, this is the way of kings. So number one, they need to know because they're kings. But he goes on, and I'm continuing, right? So the Ramban asks, so fine, you want to know the whole census? Great. You have a mitzvah, you're a king, it's part of your job. Great. But why do I need to know according to each tribe? Why do I need to know according to each family? What's this mispar shemot that we had back in Pasuk Gimel? And the Ramban says something beautiful. And he says, here, I'm going to scroll down, and he says as follows. And you can, again, you can read it in the English. So first he says that we want to know as much detail as possible because, and this is something that Rashi quotes, because Hashem loves us. And just like, you count and recount and look at and look through a collection of something that you love and you know every item in that collection, so too Moshe and Aaron are supposed to know every item in God's collection. And we're Hashem's collection. But then he goes on to say something else. And I just want to find it in the Hebrew because I think the language that he uses is really, really beautiful. He says as follows, here, that each person, Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? Hashem says to Moshe and Aaron, to count them bekavod ubegdula, that Moshe and Aaron should count each person according them honor and greatness. L'chol echad ve'echad, each one. Not that the head of the family should come and say how many are in his family or how many sons do you have. Rather, Ella kulhon yehon ovrim lefanecha. Each person in Bnei Israel who is being counted should have the opportunity to come before Moshe and Aaron be'ema ubekavod, with awe and with honor. Ve'ata, and you, Moshe and Aaron, count them, moneh otam, one by one. Similar to the way that Hashem, we talk about unasan tokef, right? That we each go in front of Hashem one by one, and God knows each of our names and each of our identities. So too, when Moshe and Aaron are counting humans, they're not counting numbers. They're counting names. They're counting identities. So again, that when we count, whether it's people or days, there's a deeper meaning to it. It's not casual. Our lives as Jews, our lives as people created in the image of God, we are body, but we are also soul. That's not a casual existence. There's this, the word mindfulness is a big word that's used now, and it's a wonderful word. But that's what Judaism is. That's what being a Torah-oriented Jew is exactly that. It's mindfulness. It's that every action that we do should be imbued with mindfulness, and that we are doing a mitzvah. We are doing something because Hashem told us to, and we do something because Hashem told us to. It will make us better. It will be good for us in with a capital G. And so when we think about usfartam lachem mimacharat Shabbat, that you count for yourselves, you record the days, you're mindful of the days, you're mindful of your relationship to God, that is for yourself. It's not just ticking off 1, 2, 3, right? And in Chassidut, each day, right, and each week is part of this concept of sfirot, of spheres, of levels of holiness. The idea is that as we count, we spiral higher and higher and higher. And that's, in my opinion, really what this is about. So I just want to kind of move on to this idea of the number 7 and why it's so important, and why the day of Pesach, the Chag, is referred to as Shabbat. By the way, this is the reason why the Karaites, right, the ones who interpret the Torah just based on the text, start counting their Omer the day after the first Shabbat after Pesach. Right, that for them, usvartem lachem mimacharat Shabbat, and you should start counting from the day after Shabbat. They don't take it according to the way we understand it, which is based on the oral tradition, right? The oral law, that Shabbat here means Yontif, means Chag, means Pesach. They take it very literally. And there's a big question as to why Pesach here is called Shabbat, and I'm not going to get into it deeply, but let's just look for a minute about what is Shabbat. So again, Shabbat, which is the seventh day, right? Vayar Elokim, this is the end of creation, and God saw everything that he made. V'hinei tov ma'od, it was really good, meaning it was perfect. Creation was perfect. At the end of 6 days, God did everything that he had set out to do, and it was a perfect universe. And what was God able to do then? He, once heaven and earth was completed, God declared it done. Yom hashvayichal Elokim b'yom hashvi'i melachto asher asa. God completed, he sealed off what he had done on the seventh day. And then he did asher vayishpot, and he rested on the seventh day from all of the work that he did. And then he blessed the seventh day and he made it holy. Why? Because he rested, because he stopped. Shabbat and 7 and the seventh day is a number of completion. Right? It's completion in the natural order of things. A week is 7 days. Why is a week 7 days? Why isn't it 5 days? Why isn't it 10 days? Why isn't it 22 days? You know, we have somehow have this arbitrary thing called a week. That's 7 days. Well, it's 7 days because Hashem created the universe in 6, and on the 7th he said, we're done. We're done. I'm declaring it done. It's closed, and it's closed because it's perfect. So what this idea of Shabbat is, as opposed to the idea of Moed, Shabbat is God's day. Shabbat is the day that Hashem decides. By the way, that's why in Shmona Esrei on Shabbat, we say, Baruch atah Hashem mikadesh HaShabbat. Right? Hashem made Shabbat holy. He made it holy. He made it separate. He made it distinct. On Chagim, we say mikadesh Yisrael v'hazmanim. Right? Hashem made us holy, and then we made time and Chagim holy. So Shabbat and this idea of 7, and the two ideas go together, right? Mimacharat Shabbat, which Shabbat is the 7th day, represents completion. And then that's also why we have this idea of Shemitah, right? In the 7th year of these cycles, again, it's a complete cycle. We take a rest, we take a break, we take an economic break. We're coming up here in Israel, I mean, all over, we're coming up to the Shemitah year. Shemitah is a reset, just like Shabbat is a reset. Shemitah is a reset of debts, of loans, of letting indentured Jewish servants go free, of letting the land rest, again, of kind of stepping back and acknowledging, okay, the world is as Hashem wanted it. It's complete, it's holy. And we're kind of giving over ourselves to trust in Hashem. So then what is this idea of the 50th year, right? Or the 50th day? Why not just 7 weeks, right? 7 days, 7 weeks, cycle, great. 7 years, 7 Shmitot, cycle, great, wonderful, done. But it's not done. There's this 50 thing, right? It's this 7 times plus 1. So again, we go back to Abraham. We have this idea of 7 plus 1, and 7 plus 1 being associated with a covenant, right? 7 plus 1, which is 8, the 8th day is the Brit Milah. 7 plus 1 is the supernatural. It's the miraculous. It's the Lamala Min HaTeva. It's going beyond. The Brit is on the 8th day for lots of reasons. But one of the reasons that's given for the Brit being on the 8th day is because it seals one natural cycle and then goes one step beyond. And it represents body plus soul. So when we count 7 weeks and then we count towards the 50th day, we're counting 7 natural cycles until we get to 7 times 7. And then we get to that 50th day, like we would get to the 50th year, right? And here, same kind of language, usvarta lacha, and count for yourselves, Sheva Shabbatot, right? And not Sheva Shabbatot as in 7 weeks, but in Sheva Shabbatot as 7 Shemitah cycles. You see the parallel in the language here, right? The Yovel, the Jubilee, which is that 50th year where everything gets a reset, is like the 50th day, or the 50th day is like the 50th year. We've like spiraled higher and higher and higher, and now we've gotten basically to the top. Right? We talk about how Bnei Israel were on the 49th level of impurity, and at Matan Torah they went to the 49th level of purity and then beyond. That idea of reaching the 50th day is the idea of that being about as close to miraculousness as we can, that we're pushing ourselves higher, through nature, through nature, through nature, through nature, 7 times until we get to that number 50, right? And 50 is like, wow. It's just a wow number. It's actually a very rare number in Tanakh. 50 days and 50 years are, I think, the only times that 50 really appears. It's kind of a very mystical type of a number. So that's what we're counting towards. We're counting towards that wow. Okay, you have the translation here, right? And that wow is Har Sinai. That wow is Kedusha. That wow is holiness, that being separate, that being above, that being beyond. And that's what a korban is supposed to do for us. I'm going to go back, all the way back, scroll back to the beginning, right, of the shir here. What do we do? Usfartem lachem imachrat Shabbat, right? We count for ourselves, for our benefits. We introspect, we take accounting for, right? We connect to the stars, we connect to Abraham, we connect to the concept of Shabbat. We connect to the harvest and the fact that we are dependent on Hashem, right? And we do this 7 weeks, 7 times, and they're supposed to be whole. By the way, by the Brit Milah, what Hashem says at the beginning of that parak is veheye tamim, be whole, be pure, right? So ad mimacharat, until after that day beyond, right? We start with the day beyond Chag HaPesach, we go to the day beyond. We start already beyond that 7th week, 50 days, v'hikravtem mincha chadasha laHashem, and we come close. We bring a gift. A mincha is a gift. By the way, that's the word that it did by Cain and Hevel. So why are we also counting? We're again, between the Shabbat and the word mincha, we're reconnecting to the beginning of time, to the beginning of the world, and we're bringing a new gift. We get a do-over. Every Shabbat, we get a do-over. Every day, we get a do-over. And every Shemitah cycle, we get a do-over. And every 50th day, we get a miraculous do-over. So just to summarize, why are we counting? We're counting to rise. We're counting to introspect. We're counting to be better. We're counting to remember that we are holy creatures, that we are body, that we are soul, that we are created in the image of God, that each day is a new gift and a new chance. And we treat it with holiness and specialness, and it's an amazing gift. And that's where we end. And I'm going to stop the screen share. And I'm happy either for Sharon to read questions if they're in the chat, or you can unmute yourselves and ask questions. I'm here. I'm ready for you.
Well, you were so clear, Leah, that there are no questions. There are no
Do I have to-
comments.
Do I
You
have to do
wa-
the
You have
Bueller?
wowed us. You have wowed us, okay? So
Bueller, right? No, really, but please
fine.
feel free to ask questions or
do
comments
you
if
want to
you
have
have
any
them.
comments or questions?
I found it to be a very enlightening share, and I thank
you.
you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
that's a,
It was really wonderful, Leah. I have to say, I always feel, and I shared it at my Shabbos shir this past Shabbos about counting, and how good I feel when I finish counting. I didn't realize, and that's really what it is, that as I'm counting up and getting closer to Hashem, I just feel good because I feel complete after having counted.
Oh,
So,
mission accomplished, Marcia. Mission
yes.
accomplished.
almost there, almost.
Almost
24,
getting.
24.
I don't even want to say because I don't want to mess it up, but I think so.
That's just- whatever. Anyway,
It was a pleasure listening to you because you always make such sense.
Oh, thank you, Lori. I appreciate that a lot. I try. Any other questions or comments?
I was looking forward to it and I'm not disappointed.
Thank you,
Loved it.
Tova. That means a
I
lot. I know
loved it. I
you're
loved it.
Israeli. You have high standards, you know.
Thank you.
Thank you. And again, I want to, Sharon has Sharon, Tova, Karen, some of you have Lori. People know how to reach me. So if there are others of you who, don't necessarily want to ask a question right now, but want to shoot me an email or a Facebook message with a question, please feel free, and I'm happy to answer it.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Leah,
Thank you.
Leah,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say thank you for making the counting of the Omer so much more meaningful.